Hi, today we're going to be looking at the issue of frontier conflict and resistance in Australia. Before we can get to that, there's a few things that we need to make sure we understand. And the first of those is the impact of settlement. After we discuss that, I'm going to make sure we understand the idea of contestability because that's really important for us to understand, not just with this topic that we're studying, but for being a good student and a good historian in overall. I'm going to talk to you first of all about the impact of settlement, and there's a few facts and figures I'd like you to keep in mind. So within years of the establishment of the European settlement in each of the colonies, the numbers of the Aboriginal people declined considerably. Within 3 years of settlement around Botany Bay and Port Stephens, up to 90% of the Durag people died. In Port Phillip, the Cullen Nation went from over 30,000 in 1835 to no more than 5,000 in 1850. Traditional hunting areas and food sources were actually disturbed as the colony expanded. So food became scarcer in the wild and traditional gathering areas were cleared for agricultural development. Fences appeared and access to waterholes or sacred sites became difficult or impossible. We also next have the fact that European intrusion displaced a lot of people in the more populous areas. So this resulted in warfare between the Aboriginal groups. And this is something that actually wasn't mentioned very often in historical accounts before this time. We also had conflict developing between the Europeans and the local Aboriginal people as the settlers spread out and the Aboriginals began to resist the Europeans. And finally, we have the diseases. They were introduced by the Europeans that spread quickly and had a huge impact. In actual fact, diseases were by far the biggest killer of Aboriginal people. Introduced diseases such as the common cold and tuberculosis that wiped out huge numbers of Aboriginals, often a generation at a time. And many diseases that were really only mildly dangerous to Europeans were lethal to the Aboriginal people, who had absolutely no immunity. They also had to deal with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases, which not only caused deaths, but they rendered many women infertile, which then, of course, led to a declining birth rate. Other diseases included measles and influenza, also spread really quickly through the population. And smallpox is thought to have wiped out at least 50% of the Aboriginal population in Australia. There is a question of whether smallpox was brought by the Macassans or by European settlers, and there's no resolution on that. People are still arguing. By the late 1700s, conflict grew between the Europeans and the Aboriginal people. In the Hawkesbury area of New South Wales, 26 Europeans and 200 Aboriginal people died as a result of conflicts that took place between 1794 and 1800. One well-known Aboriginal who resisted the Europeans was Pemulwuy. He would launch attacks on the settlers, burning their crops, destroying their huts, and he was so successful that in 1801 Governor King offered a reward for Pemulwuy's capture. Pemulwuy was shot and killed by soldiers, and the resistance movement fell off for a small time after this. Now what I want us to do is to look at the historical concept of contestability. I'm going to get you to write this definition down in your book. This one right here. So the definition of contestability is that certain aspects of history may be contested or challenged or left open to debate due to a lack of evidence or different perspectives. So much of the study of history involves not just facts, but interpretation of the facts. And I think this is one of the reasons that I love history so much. It makes it so much more interesting to me than this is the right answer. Historians examine as many relevant sources of evidence as possible to reach a conclusion about the past. But, of course, historians often disagree about the conclusions, even if they're looking at the same evidence. So this is what's known as contestability. I want you to remember that sources themselves may be biased because of the views of their creators. And also, historians may be biased by their own personal ideologies. So these historians that are looking at these sources bring in their own perspectives, and that may change the way they interpret what they're seeing. So what this means is that there's often many competing interpretations of events in the past, and there is rarely, if ever, a right answer. But that doesn't mean that you can just say anything, because some views are more warranted than others. And learning to contest the viewpoints, to challenge the viewpoints based on evidence, is a fundamental concept for the study of history. Relations between Indigenous Australians and white settlers have become a contested part of our history. Historians have clashed over the reliability of written and oral sources, and so much Indigenous history was not actually recorded in written form. So this means that historians have had to access other types of evidence. Oral histories passed down through the generations are invaluable in helping historians access an Indigenous perspective of history. So for the rest of this week, you guys are going to be doing your own research task. You're going to have to create your own graphic organizer to display the information that you find. You're going to have to actually choose a conflict that has occurred, and you have a list that you may choose from, or you may do your own research and choose one of those. And the main thing that I want to make sure that you do is that you think about contestability while you're doing this. I want you to think about the perspectives of other people, not just your own perspectives while you are doing this task, but the perspectives of the people who created the primary sources that you will be looking at. I want you to consider contestability. I want you to think, can I challenge this viewpoint? Of course, we need to remember that there is no right answer, but you really need to make sure that your views are warranted and you can back them up with the information that you're finding. Finally, I want to make sure that you really consider other people's views. That doesn't mean you have to believe what they believe, but give them a chance and actually listen to what they have to say. There will also be a research template that you'll be required to hand in, as well as your graphic organizer, and that's going to be explained when I give you the task, which is also on Schoology.